The goal is to create a community where everyone has a home. And that vision was to turn these barns into a community place. Could we do something here that is place specific and special and unique? We can actually change hearts and minds. We can move away from the status quo. Here we are at Witchwood Barns, which is a really good example of adaptive reuse. These barns behind me were streetcar barns. This was the terminus of the streetcar line, and it's where streetcars were maintained, and it was built back in 1916, and several new barns were added over subsequent years. What's so fascinating is that back in 1996, these were just derelict buildings. They were no longer used for the maintenance of streetcars. And there was this big question, what should happen on this site? It's in the middle of a robust residential neighborhood. And so, of course, an obvious solution seemed to be to build new residential housing, to fill this entire site with new homes. One of the challenges was that these streetcar barns had been left in a state of disrepair for many years, and many felt they should just be torn down, ripped out, gone forever. But the local councillor and many community groups had a very different vision, and that vision was to turn these barns into a community place. And so what you see behind me is the street, the new street. It's an indoor street that was created. There are 9 community organizations that function on this site. It's owned by the City of Toronto, and Artscape, a community arts organization, operates this as a cultural hub, a vibrant place for community gathering, for food production, for brewery nights and arts nights and trivia nights. But there's also places for children to play, and there's also places for artists to live and to produce community art. It's pretty special for me to be here today telling you about the story of the adaptive reuse of Witchwood Barns, in part because when I was just a grad student with a twinkle in my eye, planning for and learning about a career in planning, I did a placement in a city councilor's office. And that city councilor was Councillor Joe Mahevic. And one day he handed to me a blue file folder. And in that blue file folder, all it said on top was TTC Barns. And in that file folder was a plan to create a subdivision, a new subdivision in the middle of this neighborhood. And he handed it to me and he said, "Is this what you think should happen here?" And that was the beginning of a process that involved bringing in Artscape as a not-for-profit partner to turn this into a cultural hub. It was the beginning of a process of bringing in a talented architect, Joe Lobko, to begin the re-envisioning of this site. It was the beginning of the process that involved bringing in a heritage architect. At that point, the idea was that these barns were just a piece of junk, that they should be torn down, that this part of the story of the city was over, that something fundamentally different should happen here. But instead, as a result of the community consultation that Artscape undertook, as a result of the work of Joe Lobko, as the result of the heritage analysis of this site, these buildings were restored to become the heart of a community place, a place for gathering, for events, for art production, for food production, for community building. This site was transformed because many years ago a question was asked, could we do something here that is place specific and special and unique to this community? So on this site, we have Somali organizations, we have a Tibetan Global Food Network, LEAF, an environmental organization, is located on this site. There's a children's art studio that offers children's arts classes, and also a theater group that both performs and rehearses on this site. There's also the Witchwood Barn Community Residents Association that takes carriage of the community interests and ensuring that those interests are integrated into the community programming. This site also has, wait for it, of course, always needed in the Toronto context, a dog park. What's important here is that by working collaboratively with the neighborhood, the vision here has been to be additive. This isn't about one idea, it's about many ideas. It's not about one culture, it's about many cultures. It's not about one activity, it's about many activities, and it's about creating a place where the community can come together and experience and learn and share and grow and ultimately flourish. So one of the risks with this type of an adaptive reuse project is that if it becomes incredibly successful, it could also counterintuitively become incredibly exclusive because the homes in the adjacent neighborhood have actually increased in value. This is actually a great place to live. This is a great neighborhood. For that reason, it's really essential in thinking about these types of projects to integrate from the outset the delivery of housing that is affordable. And that's exactly what happened on this site. So there are artist studios. So artists can live here as well as producing art here and performing here. There's also a gallery for the display of local art. And that covered street, those barns that we saw earlier, that covered street is often a place of the production of art. Now it also has a brewery festival and a widely renowned trivia night that is a fundraiser for the overall barns. But the production of art in this space, right in the heart of a neighborhood, is a really important part of the community building, but it's also an important part of supporting the flourishing of artistic activity in our cities. One of the reasons why this site is special is because, as is often the case in our best city building, we haven't shied away from complexity. The artists' studios and homes that you see behind me have been integrated into heritage buildings that it would have been a lot easier to just go ahead and tear down. But instead, using a lens of environmental sustainability and recognizing the embodied energy that exists in the materials on this site, there was a different approach that was taken, one that looked at the existing bricks and mortar as an asset that could deliver on creating a truly special community place. I'm standing here in Regent Park in front of the beautiful new Pam McConnell Aquatic Center. It might be hard to believe looking at this spot right now, but once upon a time, this was Victorian row houses that were built at the turn of last century. In the 1950s, we tore down those Victorian row homes and we built new social housing in super blocks in a tower in the park type of built form. Very quickly, this became an unsafe community. There were no grocery stores, there were no amenities like community pools, and there was a tremendous problem with crime, with vandalism, with disrepair, and also a real lack of opportunity for the residents who live here because they really weren't connected very well to the rest of the city. Enter the past 20 years, and we've just gone through a process of urban revitalization that is a pretty phenomenal example of gentrification without displacement. This has become a mixed-use, mixed-income community. And the residents who've lived here for many years, as well as new immigrants coming into this community, come into a vibrant neighborhood that includes a whole variety of different cultures and different people, different income groups, also different built forms. There's townhomes, as well as condo towers, as well as rental housing. And as a result, this is an emerging, vibrant, new place that is well connected to transit and well connected to jobs, really in the heart of our city. Transforming an urban place where people already live into something better is a tricky exercise for a whole variety of other reasons. Sometimes in our cities, we take a few different stabs at the built form before we actually get it right. We've hit a point where we do believe that we've gotten the built form right here in Regent Park. And that's for a really critical reason. This is not a place that's just about the buildings. This is a place that was designed by leading with the public realm, by leading with park spaces and community amenities, by leading with a cultural center where art can be both performed and produced, by integrating some of the commerce that was missing, access to a bank access to a grocery store. These were things that didn't exist within walking distance in the past in this neighborhood. By getting the density right and getting the mix of uses and users right in this neighborhood, we've been able to create a complete community. So this is a place where you can come from almost anywhere in the world and begin your life as a Canadian citizen and thrive because of access to jobs, because of access to education, because of a thriving community where people are connected to one another because of the public realm and the amenities that exist here. This is a fascinating story of urban evolution. Initially, this was Victorian homes that became slums over time. They were places that were in an incredible state of disrepair and really could not be improved. Those homes were cleared, and this became a community of social housing. But in some ways, we made a critical mistake at that point in history by putting too dense of a cluster of social housing in one area of the city. So there was a challenge because there was so much social housing here that many people became trapped in a cycle of poverty. This actually became one of the least desirable areas in the city, and newcomers who came here put their names on a list as quickly as possible to be transferred out of this neighborhood. So the whole idea behind the new vision for Regent Park was to figure out a way to make this a community where people could thrive. But at the same time, there was this very sensitive issue of ensuring that the people who lived here were not displaced. So as market housing was added, as new housing was built, residents were moved out of the neighborhood to other social housing in the city, and then they were given the opportunity to come back. That initiative had mixed success. Some people didn't, in fact, come back at all, and some people felt the weight of displacement, even though they weren't being gentrified out of their neighborhood, because they were being welcomed back. They felt the weight of that transition of having to move somewhere else. So as we move into the third phase of building out Regent Park and mixing up market housing with social housing, we're ensuring that residents can stay here as the construction process proceeds. The great irony of how this community was planned in the 1950s is that it was called Regent Park, but there wasn't a park. So all of the park that you see here, the children playing today, this didn't exist. This was covered in housing. And you can even see in the background behind me some of the lower level brownstones that are being redeveloped in the next phase of the redevelopment. Part of the trick we've tried to figure out here is how to get the balance right between public space and urban density, as well as the mix between market and social housing, as well as affordable housing. Part of what we've tried to figure out here is how we can get the mix right in creating a really strong and vibrant community. And that mix means different types of built forms, so taller buildings with row homes, but also the mix of tenures, the affordable and the market, the rental and the ownership. And then on top of that, of course, the mix of uses. Access to food, community gardens, which now exist in the park, are a really important part of the community building that this next evolution of Regent Park has been able to deliver. Part of what makes this a particularly special redevelopment is the private-public partnership that was created between the City of Toronto, which is the regulatory authority, the Toronto Community Housing Agency, which is responsible for social housing, and then a private developer who was brought in to deliver on the public objectives of this overall project. This developer was selected through an RFP process, but also brought to the table a very deep commitment to the city building objectives of creating an inclusive community and a place that people would thrive. It's tricky to manage and negotiate these types of partners. It takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of effort, and if you get the wrong partner, it can really upend the entire project. That wasn't the case here. This is an example of a truly successful public-private partnership. So I'm going to take you on a little journey here, a tale of two cities, if you will. You can see in the background behind me the 1950s social housing that was built all over this area. It was just social housing. There were no other uses. And the first thing that we wanted to get right in re-envisioning this area is really the density, ensuring that there's a sufficient mix of people and uses to be able to deliver on a walkable place, what Jane Jacobs called sufficient density for urban living. So you can see here some of that density unfolding in the background. Importantly, the earlier images you just saw really didn't put any emphasis on design or design excellence. We wanted to get the density right, but we recognized that design and design excellence matters too. The third critical thing that we've delivered here is that this is a complete community. It's a mixed community of both market housing, affordable housing, and social housing. And all those buildings are mixed up in the landscape. You can't tell which building is which. The goal is to create a community where everyone has a home. It may not seem like it as I sit here today, but this King Street Priority Transit Corridor was produced against all odds. It was incredibly challenging to execute, but its immediate success has resulted in really significant public support. Now, what is the King Street Transit Priority Corridor? This is an initiative where we ask the question, how can we get a quick win when it comes to transit? How can we significantly increase transit capacity in an area of the city that is growing quickly? And we wanted to do this without putting a shovel in the ground and without a lot of money. So what we did on this corridor was we changed how we use the roadway. Before we did this, we did a comprehensive analysis of the existing conditions, looking at travel patterns, looking at the road network, asking questions about where cars would go if we took them off this corridor. And a phenomenal thing happened. We discovered that while cars use 64% of the right-of-way, they only move 16% of the people. The heavy lifting already was being done by transit. But the problem we were trying to solve, that problem was that transit was moving at slower than the pace of walking. So we implemented new policy. We changed the way the corridor is used. And as a result, we saw a phenomenal increase in transit access, in travel times along the corridor, and also in the vibrancy of the corridor overall. You can see right behind me a new parquet that we added once we took away a travel lane for cars, which were no longer conflicting with the transit infrastructure. There was a time when the corridor behind me was just bumper to bumper vehicles. And we asked the question, is there a way that we can significantly increase the capacity of the transit function of the corridor? Simple physics, transit can move a lot more people than individual vehicles can. And as a result, we put in place a plan that only allows vehicles to move one block at a time. Now you may say, why didn't you get rid of cars altogether? Which in an ideal scenario, we probably would have done. But we were weaving our plan into an existing urban fabric. And in that existing urban fabric, there are actually entrances to driveways and entrances to parking garages along the corridor. So in creating a place-specific response, we had to ask the question, how do we ensure that we don't cut off access where access is needed, while at the same time delivering on the transit benefits? And we did that through a very bespoke plan. I wouldn't recommend implementing this same plan in any other place, because we used the analysis of the existing context, we used the analysis of the data, we used the existing built form in order to deliver a very different type of transit solution that results in a significant amount of transit capacity. In trying to get this off the ground, one of the challenges for any person in a bureaucratic position like I was at the time as the chief planner of the City of Toronto is that on the one hand, you want to advance things that are strong public policy, but on the other hand, you have to build consensus and you have to build political support as well as support amongst a whole variety of different constituencies. So we began with a public process that involved bringing a whole variety of community stakeholders right into the heart of the design process. But I also went to the mayor and I said to the mayor, we have this vision of trying out an approach to transforming transit access in our city. And I said to him, what would you need from us in order to support this type of an initiative? And he said, bring me data. Bring me data that demonstrates that this is going to be in the broader public interest and that it is also going to be a win for the general public. So that's exactly what we did. We worked with businesses and we collected point of sale data. We collected traffic transportation data for the broader area, but also along the corridor. We partnered with the University of Toronto and we brought all kinds of students to the corridor who counted people, who counted activities on the sidewalk, who also counted traffic. We then began to build a case. So this is prior to the initiation of the pilot. We then began to build a case for how we believed, and we were really scientists here, testing a hypothesis for how changes to public policy could actually deliver a better transportation outcome in the corridor. Once we had all that data, we built a narrative and a vision around that data, and then we brought a vision for a plan to City Council. What was really critical, once Council approved proceeding with the pilot, what was really critical was those first weeks of implementation. And I've got a great little story I'm going to tell you, which is this. Right when this pilot was initiated, I got in a cab with my children. I was going somewhere on vacation, and the taxi driver said, have you seen what they've done to King Street? They're going to destroy the city. My kids were in the car, so I looked kind of knowingly at them and said, no one say a word. Because of course, it was the plan that I had brought forward that had been implemented. Several weeks later, I was again in a cab with my children, and we got in, and a different taxi driver said to us, have you seen what they've done on King Street? I thought it was going to ruin the city, but it's actually improved traffic for taxi drivers as well. That's the really powerful part about doing things in our cities that are against all odds. We can actually change hearts and minds. We can move away from the status quo. But we have to be willing to use data and vision to drive forward new kinds of approaches that are going to be more equitable, that are going to be more sustainable, that are going to support local businesses, and that are going to allow people to move with a tremendous amount of freedom, even in dense urban cores. Any good plan looks obvious in retrospect, but the truth is, the King Street Transit Priority Corridor was not without its controversy. There were business owners along the corridor who felt that taking away the drivers and taking away the cars would reduce business and access to the businesses that are here. Now, this corridor serves our financial district. It also serves our theater district. It also serves a creative district. And it also serves lots of young people who live in the condos along the corridor. But some of these business owners really had a misperception about the extent of people that arrived to their businesses in cars. And so they believed that if we got rid of the cars on the corridor, that they would lose their clientele. And so they launched a campaign against the King Street Transit Priority Corridor, arguing that it would be bad for businesses. The good news is we're now a couple of years past that point, and we've seen businesses absolutely thriving because they've also reclaimed all kinds of space along the corridor, and they've been able to enhance the number of patrons that are using their services. But this got really hot, and it's important not to forget that when you're in the heat of a planning process, and you might begin to self-doubt whether or not something's going to be a success. Because remember, we had a vision and we had data, but we didn't have certainty about the outcomes. That was never the case, and we were very careful about the promises that we made in the planning process, precisely because we did not know in real time what the outcomes were going to be. We hoped that travel times would significantly reduce, and they did. And we hoped that transit ridership would significantly increase, and it did. But we had no way of knowing these things for certain, because this exercise had never been undertaken in this city before. So when these restaurant owners came forward They launched a really, really powerful media campaign. It targeted me personally. It targeted the mayor personally. Of course, there was self-doubt. It also caused us to be extra sophisticated and careful in our due diligence in moving forward in the process. But it's important when you meet that kind of opposition, first of all, to take it seriously, to carefully weigh the criticism that is being lobbied at you, but to not lose your courage in advancing with innovative projects, particularly if you know that they're better for urban density, that they're better for sustainability, that they're better for equity, and that they're going to deliver on positive city building outcomes. We're here in the West Don Lands, which was built out through a master plan created by Waterfront Toronto, and it involved literally decades of public consultation. And that's part of why you see this phenomenal outcome. But one of the tensions that we face in our consultation processes is that often people with the most access to the process are the ones we hear from. When I was chief planner at the City of Toronto, we asked a really critical question. We wanted to see who it was who was showing up and participating in our community meetings. Not surprisingly, we discovered that despite the fact that over 50% of the people in this city are renters, and over 50% of the people in this city were actually born elsewhere, they weren't even born in this city, that the vast majority of people participating in city planning processes are actually homeowners who are white and over 65. So we devised a solution to address this challenge, and that solution is called the Planning Review Panel. And what's so powerful about the Planning Review Panel is that the participants are selected through a civic lottery. And that civic lottery, which is administered by a third party, is a mechanism to bring new voices, to advise the planning department on how to proceed on key policy initiatives. The civic lottery focused on getting a diversity of ages. It focused on ensuring that there were 50% men and 50% women. It focused on ensuring that groups that are traditionally and historically excluded from planning processes and from other ways of participating in civic discourse were brought right into the heart of the overall conversation. People serve a 2-year term on the Planning Review Panel, and that 2-year term begins with something absolutely critical, which is capacity building. Many of these people, whether they're taxi drivers or teachers or newcomers to the city, have never made a deputation at City Council and don't know too much about how planning decisions actually get made in the city. City builders and politicians need to get real. When they talk about consultation, they need to talk about who they consulted. They need to talk about who participated. Because it's pretty clear that all voices have not been equal in our city building processes. We know, for example, that homeowners often oppose new infrastructure that might more be in the interests of renters who are more likely to take public transit, as a very specific example. The extent to which we identify and are clear about all of the participants in our process is going to lead to a more honest public participation and engagement process. Now, the Planning Review Panel was created to address exactly this challenge by being very specific about the voices that we're bringing into our process. For example, young people, ensuring that we've got young people participating and commenting on the future of the city. Young people have very different ideas about single-family zoning in a context where accessing affordable housing is really challenging, in part because they're the people being pushed out. Existing ratepayers have a very different position because in many ways they're protecting the asset that they currently have. All these opinions are legitimate in the planning process. But what we need to do is be clear about who is contributing what and when certain voices are not at the table. Several years ago, as we were creating a master transportation plan for the City of Toronto, and I was the chief planner, we came across this strange phenomenon, which is we were proposing great infrastructure, LRT, in some neighborhoods, and the residents were overwhelmingly saying, we don't want it. So we decided to do a little bit of a deep dive and understand just who it was who was saying no, because we knew that these were neighborhoods that had a high rental population, a high low income population, a high immigrant population, and that car ownership was lower in these neighborhoods. But we discovered something quite phenomenal, which was that at the public meetings, the majority of the people who were showing up were homeowners who were white and mostly over 65. So this led us to innovate and create something called the Planning Review Panel, where we essentially, through a civic lottery, drew together Torontonians from across the entire city, representing the diversity of the entire city, whether that be age, income, geography, sexuality, ability level. And we brought this panel together to provide advice on public policy. Something very interesting happened. Once we took the self-interest out of the policy making and we added a diversity of voices and we focused on the broader public interest, we got better advice for the kind of infrastructure that we should be building in our city that will lead to the creation of an inclusive city and a sustainable city, and a city that is going to thrive well into the 21st century as we continue to add refugees and immigrants and as our population continues to grow and urbanize and densify. So adding more voices and focusing on diversity has led us to a better public policy outcome. Our cities face phenomenal challenges. Obviously, climate change means we're going to have to rethink how we live, particularly in urban places. But we also know, as we've seen over the course of the pandemic, that inclusion and how we design our cities to ensure that everyone has a home that they need, where they can feel safe and where they can thrive, is also a significant challenge that our cities face. So the next question that emerges is, how do we build participation and ensure that our community participation allows us to advance meaningful change? And I will say the things we've been doing over the past 20 years, design charrettes and community meetings, they're not going to be enough. We need to think in fundamentally new ways about how we can bring new voices into the planning process. And that means we need different kinds of tools and we need different kinds of mechanisms. And the Planning Review Panel is so interesting in part because as a mechanism for bringing new voices into the process, it really met people where they were at. You didn't need expertise. You didn't need to show up at a very specific time in a specific place. What you needed was a willingness to serve your city. With that willingness, our team was able to work with residents to find opportunities for them to both build their capacity to participate, but also to make a real and meaningful contribution to the long-term evolution of their city. And I'll never forget our very first planning review panel. There was an elderly gentleman who came from Africa who had raised his children here and sent his children to university, and he had been driving a taxi for 40 years, very long hours. And he said when he received the notice in the mail, he thought, now is the time for me to give back. And I can tell you, imagine the insights that he had. He knew every corner of the city. He had conversations with people from every strata of life, newcomers and people who had been here forever. And that was exactly the intent of the Planning Review Panel, was to find ways to tap into the deep expertise that comes from lived experience in a city.